Yamaha TX750 head and cylinder removal and replacement. The objectives of this program are to acquaint you with the upper end of the TX750 engine. This program will provide you with a working knowledge of disassembly procedure and give you an idea of the special tools involved. To remove and replace the upper end, you will need, from left to right, the cam chain breaker, the cam chain riveter, 2 piston ring compressors, 2 piston support plates, and the TX750 slide hammer with its 6mm shaft. Begin the disassembly by loosening the mounting clamps and removing the 2 carburetors. From the rear of the cylinder, unscrew the cam chain tensioner cover. Break loose the lock nut on the long adjusting shaft and thread the shaft out of the case. The entire assembly can then be removed. This is the high-pressure oil line, which routes engine oil from the feed pump up to the camshaft area. Unbolt the banjo fitting at each end. Remove the line, and be careful not to lose the 2 copper gaskets on each banjo bolt. Loosen all the internal hex screws around the perimeter of the cylinder head cover. A tap or 2 with a soft hammer may be required to jar the cover loose. Lift it off, remove all traces of the old gasket from the mating surfaces, and wash out the cover thoroughly. Loosen and remove the 4 center camshaft mounting nuts. This will allow removal of the stamped steel oil splash guard. It keeps the cam chain from splashing an excessive amount of oil around the valve area. We now have access to the cam chain. Rotate the crankshaft until the connecting link is easily identified. The cam chain breaker uses a screw-operated shaft to press out the 2 pins from this connecting link. Press them out until the link can be removed. Immediately attach a piece of wire to each end of the cam chain. Wire one end down in front of the cylinder and one down to the rear. Do not allow the cam chain to fall into the crankcase. Loosen all 4 valve adjusting lock nuts and back off each of the adjusting screws so that all the valves are loose. As long as there is free play in the rocker arm, the slide hammer will easily pull out the rocker arm shaft. Simply thread the slide hammer bolt into the end of the shaft and tap the sliding weight against the head of the bolt. At this time, remove all rocker arm shafts and rocker arms in the same manner. Notice the oil grooves on the rocker arm shaft. They must be reinstalled in the same manner. Now, remove the remainder of the camshaft mounting nuts. There are 4 recess nuts, which require a 10mm socket, and 2 more at each end that require a 13mm socket. The camshaft and its 2 pillow blocks should be lifted off as an assembly. It is then simply a matter of slipping the pillow block off each end of the camshaft. Check the bearing surface of each block and replace any block whose surface is scored. Prior to loosening the major cylinder head studs, remove these 4 outer bolts. Numbers 1 and 3 are located in the spark plug recesses. Numbers 2 and 4 are between the cylinders. It is important when loosening the cylinder studs that you break them all loose about 1/4 of a turn and in a crisscross pattern. Do not relieve all the tension on 1 bolt at a time. This will cause the cylinder head to warp. When removing the head, extra care is required in handling the cam chain and preventing it from falling into the crankcase. Therefore, we suggest that you enlist a little special assistance during this operation. While you're at it, you might as well take this opportunity to slip off the cylinder. With a clean rag stuffed around the skirt of the piston, remove the piston pin clip from the outside of each piston. If you've ever dropped a clip into the crankcase, you know why we recommend using the rag. If the piston pins can be pushed outward with the nose of the pliers, the pistons can be taken off without removing the inside clips. However, if the interference is too great, you may have to remove both clips and press out the pin with the universal piston pin removal tool. Before proceeding further, carefully scrape off all traces of the old cylinder base gasket. Base gasket oil leaks are fairly common, and they often result from failure to clean this surface. The head, cylinder, and pistons have now been completely disassembled. Notice that the cam chain has been taped to the cam chain tensioner. This is another method for controlling it. There are a number of checks and measurements to be made concerning the pistons, cylinder bores, and the valves. For example, piston-to-cylinder clearances must be carefully measured. The cylinder should be checked for out of round, and the end gap of the piston ring should be checked. These items will not be covered in this program, but they are usually performed at this time. Start the reassembly by installing the piston rings on the pistons. The two top rings are plain compression rings, and the third ring is a three-piece oil-retaining assembly. All the piston rings can be installed by hand. But be careful not to bend the ring too far out of shape, because it can be broken. Before attaching the pistons, apply a generous amount of recommended engine oil to the upper end of each connecting rod. Also apply oil to the piston pin before you slip it through the piston. Always use a new piston pin clip for each one that had to be removed. After both pistons have been installed and you have carefully checked all 4 piston pin clips, put on a new cylinder base gasket. In cases where an oil leak has been a problem, apply Yamaha Bond number 4 or one of the RTV silicone rubber sealants to both sides of the gasket. A piston support plate has been placed around each connecting rod below the pistons. Rotate the crankshaft so that the pistons move down and rest against the plates. Then slip a ring compressor on over each piston. Notice that they straddle the cylinder studs on the front corners of the engine. The ring compressors must contact all 3 rings on each piston. Attach wires to each end of the chain and slip the cylinder down into position above the pistons. Notice the steel dowel pin on the cylinder stud closest to the lower right-hand corner of the picture. There are 2 of these dowel pins which locate the cylinder, and they're very important. Before lowering the cylinder, apply oil to each cylinder bore and to the skirts of the pistons. Push the cylinder down until all the piston rings are up inside the cylinder bores. Then remove the piston support plates and the ring compressors and push the cylinder down until it is seated against the gasket. Check the cam chain to make sure it is still rooted around the sprocket on the crankshaft. Install a new cylinder head gasket. And in cases where leakage is a problem, with a head gasket in place, check for proper alignment with these 2 threaded holes. This will tell you that the gasket is installed correctly. There are 2 more dowel pins which properly locate the cylinder head to the cylinder. They are installed on the same 2 studs that were used previously for the cylinder locating dowel pins. Install the cylinder head, making certain that it engages the 2 dowel pins and becomes seated completely. Wire back the cam chain as before and install a special flat washer and a cap nut on each of the 8 cylinder studs. Turn all 8 down finger tight and then put these 2 8mm bolts into place and thread them in finger tight. Do the same for the 2 internal hex screws near the spark plugs. They each require special copper washers. Set the torque wrench for half the value for a 10mm stud and tighten the 8 major bolts to this half value. The sequence is important. The center 4 studs are done first. Notice numbers 1, 2, 3, and 4. Then finish off with the 4 outside bolts, numbers 5, 6, 7, and 8. After all 8 have been partially tightened, repeat the same pattern to bring each stud to its recommended torque value. Set the torque on these 2 8mm bolts and the 2 8mm internal hex screws to the recommended torque of 190 inch-pounds. The cam pillow blocks are located on the cylinder head by 4 dowel pins, 2 on the outermost studs in the foreground and 2 near the center studs in the background. Apply oil to the ends of the camshaft and install the pillow blocks. Set the assembly into place and put on all the flat washers and nuts. There are 4 6mm studs that are recessed on either side of the cam lobes, and there are 8 major studs which have an 8mm thread. Set the torque in 2 stages on all these mounting studs. Use the same type of crisscross pattern that was used on the cylinder head studs. Install all 4 rocker arms and rocker arm shafts. The oil groove at the right allows oil to come up to the rocker shaft, and the one in the center feeds the oil to the rocker arm and camshaft. Therefore, proper installation is critical. Slip each one in so that this slot is horizontal. This is the only way that the shaft will go all the way into its seat. The next step is to connect the cam chain over the cam drive sprocket. Of course, the cam must be properly timed so that the valves open and close properly with relation to piston movement. In this shot, we're looking at the rear of the cylinder head. Rotate the cam so that the one punch mark tooth is pointing directly to the rear and perfectly aligned with this step in the cam pillow block. Then, rotate the crankshaft until the point cam has just opened the right-hand set of contacts. At this point, align the top dead center mark on the rotor with the stationary mark on the stator. Wrap the cam chain around the sprocket without moving the camshaft and install the connecting link. Securely rivet the connecting link using the special tool on both pins of the link. It is best to adjust all the valves at this time because the job will be more difficult after the engine is in the frame. Set all valves to a clearance of 0.02 of an inch. Apply bond number 4 to the head cover surface and install a new gasket. Before installing the head cover, remove the 4 center cam mounting nuts. Then bolt on the stamped steel splash guard and retorque the 4 studs to their proper value. Apply more bond number 4 to the cover itself. While it is not necessary to use a torque wrench on covers like this, it is recommended that all the screws be tightened the same amount and in a crisscross pattern. If the exhaust manifold was removed, install it now using new exhaust gaskets. On the rear of the cylinder, thread in the cam chain adjuster and accurately set the chain tension. Make certain that you tighten the lock nut against the cylinder. Check the O-ring here at the base of the cap. Replace it if necessary and install the cap. When reassembling the oil feed line, see that you have a copper gasket on both sides of each banjo fitting. The final step in the assembly of the upper end is to attach the carburetors. Tighten the clamps so that there's no possibility of air leakage. This engine is completely assembled and ready for installation in the frame.